Welcome to Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on Davisville Road in Shepherd's Bush, W12. 4 streets east of the Shoebox Killer. 2 roads south of where Reg Christie euthanized his dog. 2 roads southwest of the Beast. And 1 road north of the cold-blooded killer with nothing to lose. Coming soon to Murder Mile. 32 Davisville Road is an ordinary house on an unremarkable street. Built in the Victorian era, this 3-story house was once separated into flats, and behind each door, many secrets may lurk, especially around the old SEX. Such as Dad's dirty DVD of Susie Mellons Meets the Whopper Chopper, Mum's special pets being 2 rabbits, a moose knuckle and a black mamba, a daughter who denies being on the pill, but every time she pees, a swan goes infertile, and a teenage son with so many crinkly Kleenex under his mattress that if you knocked the legs off his bed, it would be the same height off the floor. Everybody has secrets, but some secrets are so dark that it makes sense for them to remain hidden. In the spring of 1949, the top-floor flat at 32 Davisville Road was the home of 40-year-old Bernard Cooper, his 38-year-old wife Mary, and their 2 children. To many, they seem like a typical but dysfunctional working-class family who was struggling to make ends meet. And although Bernard's crimes were known, a much darker secret was hidden behind those doors. One which would lead to murder. My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 259, The Lone Hand of Terror. The first 3 months of 1949 reflected the changes of post-war Britain. Although the Second World War was over in principle and clothing rationing had ended, men aged 18 to 26 were still required to serve 18 months in the armed forces. NATO was coming into effect. Britain had announced that it was developing plutonium. And that January, an anonymous national survey was carried out amongst 4,000 British people about their sexual behaviours and attitudes. It remained unpublished for 50 years. And thankfully, one of those who didn't appear in the study was Bernard Cooper. Born on the 17th of September 1908, near Radford in Nottinghamshire, Bernard Alfred Peter Cooper was one of 3 siblings to Percy and Florence. As a devout Catholic, days after his birth, he was baptized at All Souls Church, and although poor, he should have had everything he needed to succeed. But with his parents seeking a better life in a foreign land, his childhood was fragmented and lonely. Bernard recalled,
"My schooling was very poor, and I learned very little."
As on the 14th of October 1916, while a raging war burned Europe to the core, the Cooper set sail on the Eureka, a passenger ship as part of the Pacific Steam Navigation Company. And 1 week later, they arrived in the Chilean port of Punta Arenas. Raised in the southerly region of Patagonia, Chile must have felt a little like home to 8-year-old Bernard, with its lush green hills, its wealth of Catholic churches, and the endless sheep farms which became a key part of its brief economic boom. But as a stark contrast to England, it had glaciers and penguins. Given its proximity to Antarctica, some referred to it as the end of the world. And for Bernard, it may have been. As being raised in a Catholic school in Chile and not speaking Spanish, he would state that
everything I know, I learned when I left school.
And with his parents separating, that meant his father. In 1921, age 13, Bernard arrived back in England. And with 13 being the age that British education ended if you were poor and working class, he learned his trade as a house painter and a decorator from his father. At that point, he could have done well, but there were other things that he learned to love. When a child is young, they all need a good role model, someone they can learn from and get a grasp of the difference between good and bad and right and wrong. Only Percy was far from a perfect parent. At breakfast, Bernard would crack open a beer, and he had no qualms about pissing his wages up the wall. Burdened by a high sex drive, he openly admitted
I visited prostitutes at least 3 times a week.
which he would do throughout the rest of his life. And although being the spitting image of his father, 5'7" tall, medium build, with brown hair, blue eyes, a long nose and bushy eyebrows, it was uncertain where he got his violent and cruel streak. But there was no denying who taught him his criminal ways. On the 1st of August 1924, 46-year-old Percy Cooper and his 16-year-old son Bernard were hired as decorators by Mr. Crowley, the landlord of the Lavenden Inn in the village of Lavenden in Northamptonshire. In the beer cellar, they helped themselves to drinks and stole from a bowl £17, 15 shillings and 2pence, roughly £1,300 today, which belonged to the Green Man Loan and Dividend Company, which helped struggling families with small loans to get them through the week. With Percy guilty and undeniably remorseless of his crime, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. But seeing something good in the lad, as they called him, they reduced Bernard's sentence to just 2 months and sought him work while Percy was locked up. There was no denying that Percy was a bad influence on his son. In 1927, age 19, as was the law for single men, he was conscripted as a private in the Queen's Royal Army. And although it was a steady job and a regular income, where a better role model could teach him some discipline, unable to take orders, he was cautioned and dismissed for bad behaviour 3 times. When questioned, he later claimed that he joined the Navy in 1942. Only this was a lie to hide a very different crime. On the 8th of September 1930, at Brankscombe Police Court in Dorset, Bernard was sentenced to 3 months in prison for stealing gloves from a taxi. Having served only 1 year and 2 months in the 3 years he'd been in the army, he was court-martialed and dismissed from all armed forces. By 1931, as a convict, a remorseless thief, and a habitual drunk who spent more time with prostitutes than any prospective wife, owing to his cruel streak, by the time he moved to London, he was single. So it's with much sadness and misfortune that, for whatever reason, maybe poverty or desperation, a young lady fell in love with him, and what seemed to have started as something good would end with her brutal murder. 21-year-old Mary Fordham of Islington was a good woman seeking a good man to live a nice life with and to start a family. Being far from a catch, what she saw in him was uncertain. But becoming pregnant in October 1933, the right thing would have been to marry her. Only for now, it was not to be. On the 6th of July 1934, they gave birth to a daughter, who for her decency I shall call Susan. As a tiny tot who was no bother to anyone, she deserved to live a happy life full of joy, toys and treats. But just 3 months into her life, having gone back to his old ways, Bernard was sentenced to 18 months for burglary. Mary strived as best she could, only their marriage was never a happy one. As whereas she struggled and strived to make ends meet, mostly as a single mother, he spent 10 of their 17 years together, sat on his arse in a prison cell, learning ever more pathetic ways of stealing, only to end up in prison again, or half-heartedly being a husband and a father who squandered away their money on women and drink. In October 1935, with Bernard released from prison, possibly not because she wanted to, but also because they'd had a son born in an era where they'd be cruelly branded as bastards, Mary and Bernard married in Hammersmith. Mary was now tied to a thief, a drunkard, and a womanizer for the rest of her life. And although he would cruelly murder her, he was capable of something much, much worse. Barely 6 months into their marriage, and just 2 years into Susan's life, on the 2nd of April 1936, again Bernard was sentenced to 18 months in prison on the charges of theft, burglary, and common assault. 3 weeks earlier, on the 12th of March 1936, Bernard broke into Park House, a country estate in Harrow-on-the-Hill, which was then the residence of a Swedish diplomat called Johann Stiel. With Johann's party having died down and his guests having gone to bed, that night, when any good father would have read their daughter a bedtime story, tucked her into bed, and checked up on her any time she had a bad dream, Bernard broke into Park House via a side window, and as taught by his father, he stole money, goods, and drank their drink. Being sat in the sitting room and lounging on their sofa, as he quaffed 3 bottles of expensive wine, being cocky and remorseless, he wrote a series of notes to the owner, which he left dotted about the house. The first read,
You can call the police if you like, but they won't catch me.
The second read,
You surely know a good drop of drink.
as he slugged back yet another glass of Chateau Margaux. And thirdly, insultingly it read,
I must say, you all snore like pigs. Thanks.
which he signed.
The Lone Hand of Terror.
Bernard didn't have an ounce of compassion for his victims. He never did. And as he stumbled about, with his staggering legs bouncing off every table and toppling every ornament onto the floor, Lawrence O'Shea, a guest of Johann Stiel, grabbed the burglar. A scuffle ensued, and Bernard hit him across the face with a fire poker. Bernard was convicted of burglary and another count of housebreaking. Only this wasn't his worst crime. Another lengthy spell in prison did him no good. And having lost contact with his father as well as his younger siblings. All he had now was Mary and the children, who deserved much better than him. In 1937, while he was serving his sentence, desperate to live a better life, Mary left him and took their children with her. She'd had enough of his drinking, his crimes, and his cruelty. He wasn't a husband or a father who claimed he was providing for his family, as the only person he thought of was himself. The longest he lasted in any job was 3 years, until he was dismissed for drunkenness. But he promised that he would change. In January 1938, upon his release from prison, as the Second World War loomed, Mary took him back. A month later, he was arrested for the possession of a firearm, theft, burglary, resisting arrest, and the attempted murder of a police constable in Paddington. On the 8th of March 1938 at the Old Bailey, convicted of the lesser charge of grievous bodily harm, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Aged just 29 years old, Bernard Cooper had committed several serious offences for which he showed no remorse. He was evil, and yet the burglary of a diplomat, the attempted murder of a policeman, and the later murder of his wife weren't the worst crimes that the lone hand of terror would commit. That was yet to come. By 1942, as many British cities burned and were blasted apart by the Luftwaffe's bombs, Bernard said he'd enlisted in the anti-tank unit of the British Army, only to be honourably discharged 4 years later. But this was all a lie. In truth, he was in Brixton Prison serving 7 years for almost killing a constable. Released in 1946, he moved in with his wife Mary, their 11-year-old daughter, and their 10-year-old son into the top-floor flat at 32 Davisville Road. Already a troubled marriage, their relationship was strained as this wayward father and husband had missed most of their lives. And although he would blame his actions on drink, a bout of herpes, and having his left cheek scarred, having been knocked unconscious for 3 days by a falling window pane, his real criminality and cruelty had begun under the tutelage of his father. In 1948, having served 3 months for burglary, upon his release, he squandered their money on pints and prostitutes. It was then that he committed his most abhorrent of crimes. Susan was only 14 years old, a young girl in the blossom of womanhood with her whole life ahead of her. In their own home, which should have been a place of innocence and happy memories, he raped her. He raped his teenage daughter for the sake of his carnal lusts, ruining her mind and scarring her body. As a pitiless man who was worth nothing, having forced and stripped her, he treated his own offspring like one of his badly paid whores. And with the fetid stench of drink on his breath, her first experience of what should have been with a boy she loved was instead an incestuous rape by her own dad. It was a secret she was forced to keep silent about. Only nature is impossible to silence. in October 1948, with Susan's belly swollen by a fetus, which had been fathered by the monster who had fathered her. As a rape allegation hung over him, he admitted his crime to his wife Mary. The pregnancy was terminated by a surgical abortion, and with no arrest, it was likely this was kept secret. It was an impossible decision for Mary to make. Bernard was an evil man who'd done the unthinkable. With nowhere to run to, no money of her own, and 2 children to care for. When he promised,
I'll never touch her again, if you take me back.
the best of the worst options was to agree. But with all 3 of them still living in the same flat, she knew she couldn't keep an eye on him all of the time. Bernard tried to resume his decorating work, but failed. He tried to earn a decent living any way he could, but failed. He promised her he'd stop seeing sex workers, stating,
I've been faithful to you all this time, except for what happened with Susan.
but the more he failed at life, the more he drank. At the start of March 1949, unable to trust this loathsome paedophile, who was a liar and a drunk, who lived in the same 3-roomed flat as the wife he had begun to assault and the daughter he had raped and traumatized for life, Mary accused Bernard of interfering with Susan again, which he denied. In Bernard's own arrogant words, she nagged him, and she nagged him, and she nagged him. And rightly, every time his lascivious eyes drifted towards the sullied frame of her once virginal child, it made her furious. Everything came to a head on the evening of Thursday the 31st of March, 1949. With Susan asleep and sharing her bed with her cousin Gwendolyn, the simple act of having to sleep next to a man who she despised must have sent a clammy shiver down her spine. And although for the sake of her children, she tried to keep the peace, it all became too much for her that night. The argument was a hushed one, which with whispered curses awoke no one who was already asleep. Bernard had been slowly seething, as Mary had accused him of having sexual intercourse with his own child that morning, which of course he denied. In the early hours, Bernard would claim,
I tried to keep my temper, but I lost it.
Slapping her across the face. In fury, he grabbed a silk stocking from the chair, stating,
I tied it round her neck, meaning to silence her.
only wrapping it twice, pulling it tight, and tying it with a double knot, even as her nails desperately clawed at her darkening throat, which bled her neck red. Weakening, she couldn't untie it.
I knew what I was doing,
Bernard said. And as her eyes protruded, her tongue jutted forward, and her last ever breath was held prisoner in her crushed throat. He said,
I realized I'd killed her.
During the night, Gwendolyn said, I thought I heard screams. But believing it was either a nightmare or had come from the street outside, she headed back to sleep, unaware of what had happened. And as this remorseless man removed the wedding ring from her finger, having pushed her slowly cooling body under their matrimonial bed. Bernard went back to sleep until the morning sun rose. Friday the 1st of April 1949 was a day beset by gloom. In the top floor flat of 32 Davisville Road, Susan got herself ready for school. She made a packed lunch for herself and her brother, and the two headed off, being told that their mother was ill in bed. With Bernard keen to get her out of the flat, Gwendolyn said, "He said that Mary had had a bad night, having been injured a few years before in an air raid, and he asked me to take a letter to her sister in Croydon." It took her 2 hours to get to her aunt's house, but when her aunt opened the letter, the page was blank. At 3 p.m, the children returned from school to a silent flat. Their father had gone, which was nothing unusual. But there was also no sound of chatter, no reassuring smell of an evening meal, and no hug from their mother. Later that evening, seeking signs of where their mum had gone to, Susan checked the bedroom. And under the bed, where a suitcase would have been usually placed, she found her unceremoniously stuffed like discarded rubbish. Still in a nightdress, her hair in curlers, and a look of abject fear etched upon her contorted face, as rigor mortis had fixed her features with that terrified expression forever. Susan would be haunted for life by 3 things: the rape, her father's eyes, and her mother's dead face. Detective Inspector Jennings of Shepherd's Bush Police headed up the investigation. With his one suit missing and no other suspect, a description of Bernard Cooper was put out to all stations, docks and airports. And with his long nose, his bushy eyebrows, a black scar down his face owing to a head injury, and the little finger of his right hand unable to contract, he should have been easy for the police to spot. That evening, being found incapably drunk in Islington, a slow-witted constable arrested him, let him sober up in a cell, and having forgotten to check the list of wanted felons, Bernard was released on bail. Fleeing to Ashford in Kent, with no remorse, he pawned Mary's ring, and again was arrested as a mere drunk, and was bailed when he sobered up, as the cops headed for a hat-trick of cock-ups. On the run, or more accurately a sozzled stagger, on the 6th of April 1949, a full 6 days after the murder, P.C. Johnson of the Kent Constabulary spotted Bernard outside of the Girls' County School in Ashford. Why he was there was never revealed, but having run out of money and drink, he proudly proclaimed,
"You have heard of me. I strangled my wife in Shepherd's Bush. I've been on the run ever since. I intended to give myself up at Dover, but didn't."
And finally, the lone hand of terror was arrested. With all the cockiness in the world, Bernard declared,
"I'll be perfectly frank about it. I did it, and I will tell you all about it in due course."
But not before he had a little sleep. As a pointless man who'd achieved nothing but misery. He may have expected a dose of adoration, being a sadistic killer with a self-coined nickname. But with a sensational trial of the acid bath murderer, John George Haigh, having hogged all of the limelight, the crimes of Bernard Cooper were relegated to the inside pages. Charged on the 7th of April 1949 at Shepherd's Bush Police Station, he said nothing except to ask,
The 25 shillings and sixpence found in my pocket. I want that back.
as all he cared about was money. Assessed to Brixton Prison, his report states,
He admits that all of his convictions were done when he was drunk. So drunk that he could not remember them.
which was the same convenient alibi he had used several times while awaiting trial for theft, assault, and attempted murder, as were his subsequent head injuries.
But it is our opinion that his story of drunken forgetfulness was completely untrue.
Tried at the Old Bailey on the 18th of May 1949, it took just 11 minutes to find him guilty. With Mr. Justice Hallett summing up,
It is perfectly simple, but none the less dreadful, that this is a case of plain murder without any excuse for it whatsoever.
and with Bernard giving no evidence, even his own lawyer had to open the trial with the following words:
Nothing I can say can prevent you from disliking him because of what he has done.
and therefore for his heinous crimes, he was sentenced to death. On Tuesday the 21st of June 1949 at 9 a.m, having been given communion by the bishops of Stepney, within the execution chamber of Pentonville Prison, 40-year-old Bernard Alfred Cooper was executed by hangman Albert Pierpoint. Weighing 153 pounds, his body dropped 7 feet and 3 inches, and with a dislocation of the second and third cervical vertebrae, resulting in the complete separation of the spinal cord, left to hang for an hour. The world became a better place when the lone hand of terror went limp.